Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello. Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game. And this is part 12 of my Journey to Unguro card review. I'm already back with 4 new cards this time around, including a brand new legendary and I think one of the best cards yet from Journey to Unguro. I really do think it's going to be fantastic. Not the legendary, but there's one later on in the review we'll get to. I'll let you know when we get there. But up first is the new legendary. This is Hemet Nesting Worry, of course, the Jungle Hunter. This is a 6 mana 6/6 minion with a battle cry: destroy all cards in your deck that cost 3 or less. Okay, so that is an enormously unique and totally cool new battle cry, a mechanic that we've never seen anything of the sort of in Hearthstone before. And there's a lot to discuss here and a lot to think about. So essentially, you play Hemet. He's a 6 mana 6/6. He's got a reasonable body for his cost. That's just fine. 6/6s are pretty good, typically in the meta on the board, just because they're hard to kill with 6 health from other minions. So that's all fine and dandy. But you expect the battle cry to be pretty good to make up for, just a vanilla statted minion. And that's the question. Is this battle cry actually good? Typically, destroying cards is not the best thing in the world because you need cards to win the game. But because this only destroys cards, specifically small cards that are 3 or less mana, it gives you a lot of control over what cards you're going to draw next in your deck. So if you get to turn 6 with Hemet, maybe you've gotten a few lower cost cards along the way, you've played them, you've kept up, you play Hemet on 6, suddenly your deck, let's say it just destroys 5 to 10 3 or less drops, and you're left with everything 4 mana or higher. So essentially everything you top deck moving forward in the game is going to be a high cost card. And in the late game, that's typically what you want. The worst thing in the world in the late game is to top deck a useless 1 mana card that just doesn't make an impact. You want to top deck those 6 drops, 8 drops, big spells, card generation type stuff, Kabbalist Tome. You don't want to get Arcane Blast on turn 8. You want Kabbalist Tome. You want Archmage Antonidas, right? And Hemet Nesting Worry essentially allows you to do that, but of course at a great cost. Now, a lot of people will say, oh my god, what about fatigue? That's going to make you fatigue so fast. And that is true if you go to fatigue. But how often do you go to fatigue in Hearthstone? Very, very rarely. Only in the most control v control matchups, and even then, there's usually some burst component in a deck that tends to end the game before that is even reached or relevant. So don't worry so much about the fatigue factor, because the idea of Hemet here is if you thin out your deck enough and get rid of all the junk, all the low-cost cards that don't matter, then theoretically you'll be able to just pull ahead so much in card advantage and value advantage from drawing big cards over time that you'd win before that ever became relevant. Now, of course, there are a lot of holes in that theory. For instance, imagine running this in Shaman. Let's say a mid-range or a control-style Shaman. Suddenly you killed Lightning Storm. You killed Hex. Those are low-cost cards, but still really high-value low-cost cards. There are good low-cost cards. Say you're a priest and you destroy Shadow or Death. That's going to make you feel pretty bad. So I think for Hemet to work well, and I'm not even sure he would ever work well, but for him to work well, it's not just a card you kind of toss into a control deck and call it a day. I think you have to put this in decks that have a very specific curve and a lot of thought put into them and designed around him to work. So decks perhaps that have a lot more removal at the 4 spot instead of the 3 spot aren't so reliant on early game cards like Shaman or Priest, for instance, or other classes that could certainly do better in that regard. There are also the potential for some crazy sort of gimmick-style decks, I'll call them. For instance, a lot of people are already tossing out the idea of Paladin with all low-cost cards, just a bunch of 1, 2, and 3 drops, and then Holy Wrath and Molten Giant, so that in fact when you play Hemet, you destroy everything in your deck except for your Holy Wrath and your Molten Giant, or you probably have 2 copies of Holy Wrath and 2 copies of Molten Giant. And then if you draw Holy Wrath on your first draw, there's like a 66% chance that you're going to pull a Molten Giant out and kill your opponent with a 25 damage burst spell guaranteed. But of course, you could maybe draw the Molten Giant first. You could draw Holy Wrath and pull a second Holy Wrath and only do 5 damage. So there's a lot of risks. That's a gimmick. I don't think that's ever going to work. I don't think that's relevant to the discussion of this card. Another slightly probably more viable aspect of this is something like a ramp druid, where you just don't run a lot of low-cost stuff except mana ramp cards, of which druid has 3 or 4 plus some innervates, on the hope that you get Hemet pretty early, and then you play Hemet, and every draw from there on out is Ysera. It's Yashiraj. It's Ancient of War. Druid has enough big guys and can succeed in that playstyle that if you get Hemet out early, and you're able to draw one great card at a time, that's a big, huge legendary that would normally be far too risky to run because it would compromise the reliability of your draw, maybe Hemet could work in that environment. I don't know. Those are both probably more gimmick-style decks, though, I think. I think this card is actually most viable, potentially, in just a mid-range style deck, because a lot of mid-range decks, right, they'll run a pretty substantial number of low-cost cards, and then they'll curve out pretty smoothly to like the 6, 7, maybe even 8 mana range. They're not control decks. They want to have a smooth curve, a lot of power cards in the middle of that curve. But the problem with those decks is that often, and I've done like this, for instance, in Dragon Warrior. I used to have a Dragon Warrior with some early game pirates just to get out on the board, control aggression. Then you'd curve into your mid-range dragons and your 6-drop Draconid Crushers, maybe even a Ragnaros at the end, right? But the problem with that deck is you'd be in a good spot, like on turn 7 or 8. Pretty close to finishing off your opponent. You just need 1 or 2 more really good cards, and you're hoping that you top deck Ragnaros or a Draconid Crusher. You'd even settle for a Twilight Guardian, but instead you top deck N'Zoth's First Mate. And you're like, ugh, and it's just a back-breaking blow. Because you want to have that in there to stop the early pirate game, but you just risk those low-cost cards. Hemet Nestingwary in that kind of deck would fit really nicely, because it doesn't compromise the entire integrity of the deck's curve, but it does, if you draw it on 6-7, it allows you to develop a body and reduce the risk of drawing something useless in a future turn. So I like him in that kind of environment. I think he could be, for some mid-range decks, potentially viable. Who knows how well it works. Might just be too problematic. But I think there could be some decks out there that actually do support this card. So let's go ahead and move on to the next card. The first of 2 really good cards. This one is the Servant of Kalimos, a new neutral minion. 5 mana, 4/5 elemental with a nice little battle cry. If you played an elemental last turn, the standard elemental mechanic, then you get to discover another elemental. And we've seen a lot of cards like this, discover type cards, that are very good, really playable. And usually those discover cards like this, where you play a minion and it discovers you a card, are really understated for their cost, right? You can think about stuff like Netherspite Historian, Museum Curator, Cabal Courier. All of these kinds of cards are way understated for their cost. Servant of Kalimos, though, really isn't that bad for a 5-drop. 4/5 is a sturdy minion on the board. I mean, this is a 4 mana vanilla statted minion, so you're really only paying a penalty of 1 for the fact that you get to discover an elemental. So if you could compare this to something like Azure Drake, for instance, 5 mana 4/4, draw a card. This is a 5 mana 4/5, so slightly better stats, and you get to discover a card, which is often better than drawing a card, both because it generates an additional resource for you, but also you get to control what you pick, so that means you can pick something that's perfect for the situation. Of course, the downside here, or I guess the condition, is that you do have to have played an elemental on a previous turn, but it looks like there's going to be plenty of elementals and plenty of ways to generate elementals and low-cost elementals to keep things on curve. So I don't think that's going to be difficult to fulfill. So it looks to me like this is a really nice little mid-game elemental minion that helps you refill your hand, develops the board, generates some resources, and it's an elemental itself, so it's going to activate the future turn elementals as well. There's a lot to like about this card, and the more elemental stuff I see, the more and more I think elemental as a deck archetype is going to make a lot of sense, specifically for a couple different classes that have the class tools to support it even more. So yeah, Servant of Kalimos looks great, and I think it's going to be played quite a bit in elemental decks. But it's not this card, and I think this card is just ridiculous. It's totally crazy good. It is the Blazecaller, a new 7 mana 6/6. And it's an elemental too. It has awesome artwork. It looks like the Thing from Fantastic Four, but just a little bit more fiery. And this battle cry is absurd. If you played an elemental last turn, deal 5 damage. So this is basically a fire elemental on steroids, and it even looks like a fire elemental on steroids. And you can imagine now in Shaman, Servant of Kalimos on 5, fire elemental on 6, and Blazecaller on 7 is one of the most perfect mid to late game curves I've ever heard of. Because you get to develop solid bodies, you get to act on your opponent's board with Fire Elemental's already a fantastic card that often is able to ping off little minions and just get some sort of value out of its battle cry. And then Blazecaller takes it a step further. The stats are only slightly larger, but honestly 6 health is significantly more than 5 with Flame Elemental. Or Fire... blanking on the name of the card now. Fire Elemental. There's too many fire words going around. So that's nice, but also this battle cry is even better than Fire Elementals because it's 5 damage instead of 3. So that's a very significant difference because so much stuff has 5 health and not that much has 3. So you're able to pick off bigger stuff in the mid game where bigger stuff starts to come out. Also, keep in mind that 5 damage can go to the face too. There's going to be instances where you just need to go over the top and you can combo this with like a lightning bolt, for instance, if you're playing elemental shaman, or maybe a fire, well, you couldn't combo fireball, but a frostbolt if you're playing elemental mage, and just kill your opponent with a pretty reasonable 1 or 2 card burst damage combo. You do something like 8 damage for, 8-9 mana. That's not bad. That's a good way to end the game too. So a lot of impact on the board, potential to kill your opponents, huge body itself. This one doesn't, it has the condition for elemental, but unlike fire elemental, which is unconditional, right? So there's a little bit of a risk there, but again, I don't think that's going to be a problem as long as you're pumping out elementals regularly, which all these decks seem like they're going to be able to do. Blazecaller is going to be totally absurd for swinging the board. You can also think about this a bit like Firelands Portal, another fantastic card. But Firelands Portal has a lot of downsides in that you never really know what you're going to get as far as a minion is concerned. Sometimes a really junky 2/2 that does 5 damage to your face pops out, right? Sometimes you get 3/3s from Faceless Manipulator. But with Blazecaller, you're always going to get a nice 6/6, and it's an elemental to activate your future elemental synergy turns. So, better than Firelands Portal by a mile, and just a fantastic card all around. I really think this is going to be a definitive card for elemental decks. Much like Blackwing Corruptor, I think, has enabled the Dragon decks to exist, just because that board's so important for swinging tempo, or that card is so important for swinging tempo on the board. Blazecaller is going to be just that good. And 7 mana minions like this have to have some sort of immediate impact, so even though it's a little more costly than Fire Elemental or Blackwing Corruptor, similar cards like that, it's the impact is bigger, the body's bigger, so it more than makes up for its cost. This is going to be an amazing card in elemental decks, and it's going to be very, very frustrating to play against, I suspect. So let's move on to the final card in this review. This is a new Warlock minion, the Ravenous Pterrordax. It's a 4-mana 4/4 beast with a battle cry, destroy a friendly minion to adapt twice. So there's a lot to look at here. Of course, the stats are a little under for its cost. You'd expect at least a 4 or 5 here, but that's okay because it does have a pretty strong battle cry. Adapting twice is arguably worth probably about 2 mana, right? So in that regard, this card seems undercosted a little bit, or at least fairly costed. But the problem, of course, is that you have to destroy a friendly minion to accomplish that. So there's a lot of downside here. The question is that going to be worth it? And like I said, adapting twice is maybe worth about 2 mana. Depending on the situation, it could be arguably worth more, maybe even worth less sometimes. But you have to have a minion on the board to destroy. So that's the first condition. And then it has to be a sort of bad minion, right? You don't want to destroy something else that's valuable. You don't want to destroy an Imp Gang boss, for instance, if you played this on 3 into 4. I know that's rotating out, but it's a good example. So it's got to be something junky. Now, Warlock is pretty good at developing small, junky minions. Sometimes they even have death rattles that could be beneficial if you want to activate a death rattle using Ravenous Pterrordax. So it makes sense maybe in a Zoo-style deck where you get out really early with some small stuff. You play this, destroy your patches or whatever. You get to adapt it twice, and you've developed a nice little threat. That said, I don't really know that this is going to be good enough. Destroying a minion, that minion's already activated, it's on the board, it's attacking, it's making an impact. This is just sort of a minion you're laying down that your opponent can kill or deal with. I don't know that the beast energy is significant. In other words, I don't know, this card's okay. It's not bad by any means. If you get the adapt twice, it's great. But it seems like there's some downsides. I don't really know what deck environment it fits into. Maybe Zoo, but maybe you just rather run Defender of Argus in Zoo instead of Ravenous Pterrordax. I don't know. So perhaps okay, but I don't really think this is a card that's going to see a ton of play unless some sort of menagerie Warlock happens where you get to take advantage of the fact that this is actually a beast. But really, in the end, this just feels like a card that's going to be pulled too many different ways to ever actually really find a home. So that's going to wrap it up for my review here, part 12 of my Journey to Unguro card review. Some pretty exciting cards. Hemet is maybe not great, but certainly interesting, and I love the mechanic and the design, and it's going to be fun to play around with this one. Servant of Calamus, fantastic little elemental card. Blazecaller, absurdly strong elemental card. Ravenous Pterrordax, probably okay, but just a little undefined in what it's trying to accomplish or what kind of deck it's going to live in. So I don't know that this one's going to see a lot of play. So all that said, if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions on these cards, you guys know I love to read your take on everything. You guys teach me quite a bit about these cards, so share your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.